Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Reaching Higher New Hampshire, for having me here today. It is great that Reaching Higher NH has been able to organize this important event so quickly at this very important time for our country, and with the new New Hampshire legislative session kicking off. So I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel. They are, in order of how they are seated, Josh Cowen. He's a professor of education policy at Michigan State University. He's a nationally recognized expert on school choice. His writing on school vouchers, culture wars, and other events has appeared in major media outlets. And he's author of the new book, The Privatization, which, yes, you can buy from Gibson's bookstore. So, welcome, Josh. Next, we have Christina Pretorius. She's policy director at Reaching Higher NH. She leads policy efforts and strategy. She has an extensive background in education policy. She moved to the policy team in 2020 after 6 years in communication. And as you'll hear, Christina has a deep understanding of state and local politics and the education landscape. So wonderful to have you, Christina. Next is Noah Talerski, Communications Manager at the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, which most people in this room probably already know, informs the public about New Hampshire public schools and their funding, and advocates for changes to make the system more equitable for students and taxpayers. So wonderful to see you, Noah. And last but certainly not least, we have Sean Parr, who is the Ward 2 representative on the Manchester Board of School Committee and is chair of the Education Legislation Committee. So in that role, Sean is often advocating on behalf of the board at the state level, and I just learned last night he's also an opera singer. Isn't that wonderful? Anyway, welcome, Sean. It's great to have you. And let's start with the big picture on school vouchers. And Josh, just to you first, please. When did school voucher programs begin to expand? Oh, here, this is your mic, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's yours. When did they start to expand around the country, and why?
Sure, so thanks everybody for being here fairly early this morning. Thanks Laura, thanks Nicole, thanks to NEA and Reaching Higher for having me this morning. Really do appreciate it. So school vouchers, we can get into this if we need to, have been around in modern form since 1990 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I started my work as a policy analyst. The idea for these things dates back to the 1950s. A conservative economist named Milton Friedman sort of more or less came up with the idea as articulated still today in the months following Brown versus Board of Education. Their voucher ideas proceeded in...
Whoops. Let's see if we can help you with that.
We're trying to adjust. I think we're making adjustments back here. Apologies.
That's all right. Let's try this. Voucher ideas were kicked around in fits and starts in state legislatures between 1955 and 1990, but the first modern voucher system came around in 1990. It was soon followed by a pilot version in Cleveland, Ohio, which became later the basis for litigation at the Supreme Court that ended in 2002. And since roughly 2002, since the Supreme Court kind of in a very limited way blessed these things from a constitutional standpoint, they've been growing in states across the country ever since. Just as a sort of preview of my role, I started studying these things, working on evaluation teams on behalf of state legislators about 20 years ago exactly, right as these programs are starting to grow, first based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then onward. Statewide systems like the one you have today, whether income targeted or not, have really been around for about the last decade. So these things have been growing since 1990, getting bigger each year and each session.
What was the, so they started getting bigger in the 1990s, Josh. What's the why? What was the spark that started pushing this? You said the idea's been around since the 50s, so what kind of catapulted it in the 90s?
Well, as I both say in the book, and as I think is a fairly broadly understood piece of this history, this has been the product of conservative activism, specifically a set of conservative billionaires. We're talking about Betsy DeVos, who's about 50 miles from me in Michigan, the Koch brothers, a handful of more recent players on this space, but all of the groups kind of out there pushing on the advocacy side for these things, dating all the way back to 1990. A conservative group called Bradley Foundation, also based in Milwaukee, have been sort of behind this from both the advocacy standpoint and then also in my bread and butter, the kind of generating the research base to motivate these things moving forward. So it's very much been deeply tied to conservative public policy making and has sort of taken on the flavor of the times in each case. Whether 20 years ago it was much more part of Bush era, No Child Left Behind type reforms, and today it's much more kind of part of this larger kind of political moment we're in as well.
I definitely want to run down the panel as well, but one last question for you, Josh. What impact did the pandemic have on these programs?
So, good question actually. So, it was really post-pandemic that we started to see the language around these universal voucher systems, so blowing the income cap off. Right up until the pandemic, you were having statewide programs and the income cap on these programs was getting bigger and bigger, so as to be nearly effectively universal in sort of name only, all but name only. But it really was right up until the pandemic, post-pandemic, this push for kind of universal, blow that last sort of remaining income cap off the top has really been the flavor of the month or the era post-pandemic. And that's been, and we can talk about why that is, but the pandemic era marks the change between thinking of these things and messaging these things as strictly a lower income or working family intervention. Evidence says it did some really bad things actually, but it was an intervention, at least nominally on their behalf. Post-pandemic, much more flavored toward this kind of universal idea.
Sure, and Christina, toward that end, tell us a little bit please about the New Hampshire school voucher program. You know, who gets the money, how much is it, and what can it be used for?
Sure, so in New Hampshire, our school voucher program is set up a lot like Florida's and Arizona's, where families directly get taxpayer-funded, what's essentially debit accounts, where they can use for private and religious school tuition, they can use it for expenses for homeschooling, you know, transportation, a number of things that, frankly, the Children's Scholarship deems education worthy. In terms of eligibility, right now under current law there are two requirements. One, that the child is eligible to attend a public school, so they meet those age and residency requirements. And under current law there is an income eligibility requirement, which is 350% of the federal poverty guideline, which is a really wonky way to say about $109,000 for a family of four. Notably, New Hampshire's median household income is about $93,000. So this is significantly higher than the median household income, the eligibility. So when we think about who's participating in these programs, that's a big consideration. And we find that fewer and fewer, proportionally, students who are navigating poverty are participating in these programs. Wealthier and wealthier families each year are the ones who are receiving these school vouchers. In terms of the amount, there's a pretty complicated formula for how much a student receives, but on average this year it was about $5,200 per student. So if a family has 2 students, that's $10,000, 3 students, $15,000. So there's no cap on how much a family can receive. It's really just dependent on the number of kids that they have and participating, but it's about $5,200 per student.
So we're not talking about super low income families here. I mean, low income families might access these, but as you said, you know, 350% of poverty is well above the median household income in New Hampshire.
Right. As Josh said, you know, when this program was starting, advocates said this is a way for low-income families to be able to pay for whatever they want in terms of education. But what we're finding as the program matures, it's serving wealthier and wealthier families.
What mischaracterizations, misunderstandings do you encounter, Christina? You know, you're out all over the state talking to people about this. What are some common misconceptions that you bump into all the time?
Yeah, sure. So there are a lot. There are a lot of talking points, and there's a lot of efforts around expanding these, pushing them in states, so we're seeing a lot of that. But there are 3 in particular that I'd love to talk about. One misunderstanding is that it doesn't siphon funds from public schools. And in New Hampshire and in other states, that's just not true, right? The way that New Hampshire funds our public schools, every dollar that's spent on a school voucher is a dollar that is not available to be spent on public schools, on school building infrastructure, on ensuring that our teachers are certified and well prepared for the classroom, on vocational studies, right? So every dollar that's spent there is a dollar that can't be used for public schools. The second thing is who the program is serving. So we talked a little bit about who the program is serving in regards to income, but what we find in New Hampshire is that 77% of voucher recipients were not enrolled in their public schools. So these are students who were already enrolled in private schools, they were already in homeschooling programs. So the common refrain is, these voucher programs allow families to do whatever they choose. But what we actually find in New Hampshire is it's subsidizing choices that families have already made. They've already made the decision to leave their public schools. They've already made the decision to go into a private school and things like that. And this is really just subsidizing those choices for those families. And the third one that I wanted to talk about, and it's a little bit different, but it has to do with how we talk about the real concerns around this program, right? So school voucher advocates will often say, you're only talking about funding, you're always talking about funding, you're not talking about kids. But I really want to address that, because when we talk about funding, we're not talking about the dollars and cents. What we're talking about is what that funding provides for kids. That funding isn't just, it's not just a couple of $1,000s. It's academic programming. It's going to ensuring that every student has access to a classroom that's taught by a well-prepared and certified teacher. It's, that funding is talking about class sizes in our schools. It's talking about extracurriculars and things like that. So, when we're talking about funding, what we're really talking about is opportunity for kids, and opportunity for kids in those public schools who serve all students, not just a few.
Well, and talking about funding is the perfect segue to go to Noah Tulersky at the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. So Noah, how do you see New Hampshire School Voucher Program fitting into our state's decades-long debate over school funding?
Yeah, thank you. So really going back to the start of the voucher program, it was kind of enabled by the chronic underfunding and underdefinition of a public education by the New Hampshire State Legislature. After the Claremont lawsuits in the 90s, the legislature was supposed to define and fund an adequate education, but it really took until the Londonderry decisions in 2006 to actually, kick the legislature into gear and come up with a definition of an adequate education and the components that were necessary for providing it. And the legislative committee that did that work said that things like school nurses were not required for an adequate education, even though, the state requires schools to have school nurses. They said that building and facilities maintenance, heat and electricity are not explicitly part of an adequate education. And I guess I'll take the opportunity to remind everyone that just a month ago, the state argued at the New Hampshire Supreme Court that heat is not necessary for an adequate education. On a day like this, I can't imagine what a classroom would be like without heat. And so what we've ended up with the state really underdefining an adequate education is they have a very nominal dollar amount currently that goes towards education. It's about 20 to 25% of a school district's funding, depending on the district that you're in. And so what happened is over time we built up a surplus in the Education Trust Fund instead of actually contributing funds to state building aid, to special education reimbursements. We just accrued money in the Education Trust Fund, and that enabled the New Hampshire legislature to say, well, we've got this extra money lying around, why don't we create a voucher program? Because this is something that we've been wanting to do. The underfunding of public schools created that space and that opportunity to have a voucher program just to begin with. And so I think touching on what Christina just said also is because we have such limited state funding and because it is the smallest proportion of funding of any state in the country provided by the state government, any dollars going out are dollars that are not going towards our public schools and the students in them that serve students of all needs. And because the voucher program is focusing on new liabilities for the state, students that it was not previously paying for their education, we are cutting into the limited funds that are available for all of the other students.
Okay, well, and Sean, it's great to have you here because you have that local perspective on the school board in Manchester. So how do school vouchers affect Manchester's school funding?
Thanks. Oh, it's very loud. So I would echo many of the remarks that were already here. I think in Manchester, Manchester is the largest, most diverse district in the state. We have had a bit of an increase in our funding, but we're still in the bottom 5 in the state in terms of per student spending there. So we still are chronically underfunded, as Noah was saying there. And so in Manchester, we have some serious challenges there. Over half of our students qualify for free and reduced meals. And like Christina said, one misconception is that those are the students benefiting from vouchers, but really those students can't afford to send their children to a $14,000 school with a voucher, right? That's an insurmountable barrier for them there. So our students, we have not seen a huge exodus from our schools with the voucher program. That said, I think one misconception about the program is that it's linked to a flight from public schools, that enrollment's going down, and part of it's because students are taking vouchers and leaving. And that narrative is really false. The demographic for school-age children across the state is going down, so there just are fewer school-age students in New Hampshire. And I think that that's an important misconception to kind of correct there. In Manchester, our enrollment's actually stabilized over the last couple of years, and we've even seen a small increase this year. So it's a narrative worth kind of pushing back against, I think. And in terms of how it's affecting our funding, I think what we've seen this year is that the Department of Education has prioritized funding the vouchers above funding special education. And so we saw that there were qualified, verified special education expenses in the catastrophic category, it used to be called. There were very important needs of our students, our most vulnerable students, and that fund was not fully reimbursed to public school districts throughout the state there. And that really affects a district like Manchester, where we have over a quarter of our students who have IEPs, and it really is something that threatens our most vulnerable families and students. And so I think we see funding threatened in that way because vouchers are guaranteed funding. There's no spending cap, and yet we can't guarantee that we're going to have the funds for our special education for our most vulnerable students.
Well, that's a profound impact right there. Josh, to you, Sean mentioned narratives, Christina mentioned, different narratives and mischaracterizations, and one of the narratives that you hear in news coverage of this issue includes stories from parents who say their kids would not do well in local public schools, that vouchers help their kids get the educational atmosphere that they feel is better for their child. So if those families are paying taxes, those dollars are helping to pay for the local public schools. So the argument goes, and I'm sure you've heard this before, Josh, why shouldn't those families get some public support for the schools that they feel are better for their children? Thanks.
Yeah, so a couple of things, and I want to sort of build off of what Sean just said, because this has been true all over the country. It's really, it's just not true that the typical voucher user is fleeing a public school. About 3/4 of voucher users in state after state after state, states as different as Arizona, states as different as Florida, states as different as New Hampshire, Indiana, Ohio, everywhere that I've gone, and certainly all the places that we have good data on this, which is a side issue. Data are becoming less and less available. About 3/4 of students are already in private school. So to this first question, parents, I think we need to sort of acknowledge and honor parents' experiences, whether it's in the public school or the private school. These folks are working with their kids and are going to have perspective that I think does need to be talked about and included in the conversation. But what just isn't the case is the idea that without the voucher, most parents would not be able to go to private school. In fact, it's entirely different. So the really most important way to think about these things is as public subsidies for already existing behavior and already existing decision making. And that's actually the thing driving a lot of the cost overruns, as folks here on the panel have already explained, because the state is obligating itself and will obligate itself if it expands to a universal system to choices that have largely already been made and covered by the private sector. So I think we need to kind of level set and start with that basic understanding and premise that regardless of whether or not folks are, whatever their sort of satisfaction level is or isn't with the public schools, the simple reality is the vast majority of voucher users were already in private school to begin with before taxpayers picked up the tab.
Christine, I'd love your thoughts on that too. I'm sure you hear that. They're contributing, these families are contributing to the public schools through their taxes, so why shouldn't, the argument goes, they get a little support?
Yeah, so there was a public hearing on universal school voucher expansion just last week, and one of the really interesting themes was, home educators came out and actually opposed the school voucher program. They said, hey, I made this choice myself. It is not fiscally responsible for the state to be paying for a choice that I intentionally made. And so that is a very new aspect that we're seeing this year. And so, you know, a lot of talk about how school vouchers just don't align with New Hampshire values, right? They don't align with local control, our values of local control, of fiscal responsibility, of accountability for taxpayer funds, right? You go to a school board meeting, you know, we go to our deliberative sessions, our town meetings, we see line by line what our budgets are. We have input on exactly what is being spent, right? We don't get that with school vouchers, and so it is just a very different way that the government is choosing to allocate funds that just we're hearing just isn't aligned with New Hampshire values.
Well, I definitely want to ask you about accountability and transparency in a moment, but do you know your organization holds meetings in communities around the state about education funding. So what do you hear from local taxpayers and local parents about this issue of vouchers?
Yeah, I mean, when we do our presentations in communities around the state, that's often the first question that we get is how do vouchers fit into this? How do vouchers fit into this upside down school funding system that we have in our state? And the answer is it's making it more challenging for local districts and parents and the opportunities available to their students. As Christina just said, you know, we're ending up in a world where people turn out to their school board meeting, their school district meeting, they go through the budget line by line, and overwhelmingly across the state, people are supporting the spending that's happening in their local school district. People appreciate their local schools, they want to support the students who go there. And there is a genuine concern, I feel, when people ask this question of what do vouchers mean? Because I think people are concerned about losing the limited state funding that they are getting from the state, having that siphoned away. Because if one kid leaves your school, you can't reduce the services that the school is providing, but you're losing out on $5,000 in state funding, and now that has to be picked up by the taxpayers, because you can't lay off a teacher or have fewer bus routes if you are losing a small handful of students to the voucher program. And so it's a real concern that people have that it's going to ultimately have long-term negative impacts on the quality of the education that the students in the public school are receiving.
And Sean, to you, taxpayers and parents who might show up for a school board meeting, what are you hearing from them about vouchers in Manchester?
Oh, well, I mean, I think we're hearing, you know, a lot of resistance, you know, in a lot of ways there. I think overwhelmingly we do have citizens who support our public schools, right? And around 90% of the school-age children in New Hampshire attend public schools, right? So we're really talking about like Christina said, that 77% is really going to the vouchers are really going to just those 10% of families who are sending their children to private school or homeschooling their children there. And really, I think citizens are concerned that they don't want their taxpayer money going to subsidize attending private schools, right? And I think, you know, some of the expenses, you mentioned accountability there, the expenses really have not been sufficiently audited by the state, right? So it's not just private school tuition, it's also going to out-of-state tuition. It's going to sports camps, it's going to paying for supplies and books and uniforms on Amazon.com. It's really kind of unmonitored, and you know, it's leading to a 25% error rate. Is that right? Is that the right statistic? That 25% of the applications in just a random sampling had errors in them in terms of residency or some other part of the application there. So I think citizens are concerned that, you know, public schools are under extreme scrutiny, right? And we are transparent with our budgets there, but it's not just that, right? I mean, our teachers are certified, they're licensed, they go through very rigorous training. Private schools, the teachers have no license, no certification. There's no requirement to have a state background check. The students who attend private schools don't have to take a state assessment, right? They don't have to take any of those tests that public school students do to show how they're progressing through schools there. So there's a real stark difference between private and public education, and I think our citizens are concerned about how vouchers could really negatively impact our public schools.
I want to ask all of you about accountability, and there's sort of two buckets in accountability. There's the academic outcomes, and then there's the sort of tracking how the money is being spent. So toward that first bucket, Josh, you have quoted extensive nonpartisan research on academic outcomes for kids who receive vouchers. There's a lot out there, and it's also in your book. What's the most important point that you pull out of all this research on academic outcomes?
So, this is the thing that I really need folks to understand, and I have been deeply, deeply involved in this research for 20 plus years, know all of the folks on the other side pushing this stuff, know the ins and outs of all of their stuff and what's good and what's not. Here's the basic pattern behind these voucher systems. After a few pilot-size programs showed a handful of tiny positive effects for kids who switched from public to private school in the 1990s, every single program, the bigger and the more recent the voucher system, the worse the results have been to kids. I'm going to repeat that again. The bigger and the more recent the voucher system, the worse the results have been for kids, both in terms of budgets, we've talked a lot about that, but then also in terms of academic performance. Let me give you an order of magnitude of what I'm talking about here. So I mentioned a second ago that roughly 3/4 of children using vouchers are already in private school, and that has been true from the beginning. But for that quarter or so, for that 25% of children who do switch, right up until the pandemic, we actually had a lot of information about how those children do because we knew what they were doing through state requirements on public schools. We knew what they were doing in the public school side of things. And over the last decade, in Louisiana, in Ohio, in Indiana, and DC, the 4 states that have really contributed to the knowledge base on this question because of their transparency requirements, really up to and including through the pandemic era, you saw test score declines for kids who switched from public to private school as high as what Katrina did to the test scores of kids in New Orleans for those kids in Louisiana, and on par and even exceeding what the COVID-19 pandemic did to learning loss rates today. It's some of the worst results we've ever seen on any research question in the history of education research or social science. There's a very, very simple reason for this. It's that the typical private school taking these dollars is not kind of the elite academy of Hollywood, of marketing, of movies, of storybooks. It's what I call a subprime provider. They're often pop-up schools. They jump into the market when taxpayers start flooding the zone with dollars to subsidize them. If they aren't pop-up schools and they've been around for a while, they're financially distressed anyway. They're often under-enrolled. They're under-enrolled for a reason. They're not any good. And the results show this. And so one of the things that I worry the most about all of this stuff, as much as we're talking about budgets, as much as we're talking about public school dollars, we're also talking about children and children's lives and children's futures. I've called education vouchers the education equivalent of predatory lending. And the reason that I've called vouchers the education equivalent of predatory lending, because all of you probably know, I see a lot of heads nodding, all of you know the marketing behind this: opportunity, hope, freedom, right? And there are folks out there who have had genuine struggles with public schools, either because those public schools are under-resourced or because public schools are human institutions and reflect social inequities and don't always get the promise that they're held to right. The thing that we need to know, though, from the policy perspective is that the vouchers are a solution to none of these things, and that the record is very, very clear. The bigger the worse, the bigger and more recent the voucher system, the worse the results for kids. Another way of saying that is, even though we don't have data on New Hampshire voucher kids right now, by the way, I was around for this 10 years ago. This is all by design. They tried to avoid more headlines like the ones that I just described to you about those other states. But it's as good as it's gonna get as far as those kids today. Even though we don't know, we have good, strong research to show what is probably happening to those kids right now. And the bigger and the more recent the system, the worse it is, especially for those at-risk and vulnerable kids, because they're the ones that are not going to get served. They're not going to get into those schools. Those voucher schools are not allowing parents to choose. The voucher schools are doing the choosing, and the results are showing that the results of those choices are devastating, particularly for vulnerable families.
Well, that's a pretty devastating statistic, what you just said about the outcomes get worse. They're as bad as they were for the educational losses that kids had with Katrina or the pandemic. And actually, one more question for you, Josh, and then I do want to go to you, Christina. Before today's event, we received a lot of questions from the public, maybe from some of you even here, and I'm going to share a couple of those. Here's one from someone who asks, I'm particularly interested in data from other states on the fiscal impact of voucher expansion on public funding. Also, how do other states measure outcomes and provide accountability? So while we're talking about academic accountability, Josh, let's take that second part of the question. How do other states that you studied track outcomes and provide accountability?
Yeah, so the answer is they don't anymore, for the most part, for the reasons that I just explained. And really that just changed after COVID. So different states have different requirements for what they require those private schools to do. Some do require some type of norm referenced assessment. Some even require the state exam, but they don't have to report the results in exactly the same way as the public schools have to. That is all really different. I mentioned, I think at the top, about sort of when these things started to scale up. When I kind of got involved in this work 20 years ago, it was during the first Bush administration of W. Bush administration, so this was no child left behind. All of the voucher schools at that time in DC, in Milwaukee, where I was based, eventually in Louisiana, Indiana, Ohio, places like that, where that's how we know the answers to these questions, required private schools taking vouchers to follow roughly the same academic reporting requirements. The fiscal disclosure stuff's a whole other matter, but the academic results were mostly whatever NCLB said public schools had to do, and then eventually its successor, ESSA, had to do private students. Let me give an example of what I'm talking about here when I talk about headlines. So those Louisiana results, this isn't just me saying this. I mean, I was involved in that work, but no less than the New York Times ran a story on this, and I don't have to tell you, Laura, like if the New York Times is going to cover some academic studies, right, it's probably news. They're not going to just do that. The headline that came out in Louisiana after those results was right in the first few months of the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. It said, "Dismal results surprise researchers as DeVos era begins." That was the banner or the headline of the New York Times. I cannot tell you how much that stalled the momentum of the voucher push for a time. The entire reason we don't ask those questions anymore about how children in New Hampshire are doing, or how children in Louisiana are doing, or how children in Ohio are doing, or how children in Florida are doing on academic assessments is because they can't afford any more headlines like that, and so they just don't ask the question anymore.
And we don't have the data.
We don't have the data.
Well, and we received a similar question about accountability and oversight here in New Hampshire from someone else who asks, who oversees this program, accountability for the funding and success of the program? This person says, are the students learning, growing emotionally, socially, and academically? And Christina, that's definitely for you.
Sure. So I would just echo a lot of what Josh said. The way that New Hampshire's program is structured, we have no insight. Not only do we not have any insight on how not only do we not have any information on how students are doing, whether they're growing academically, socially, we don't know, and that is by design, but also the administration of the program, of these public dollars, is contracted out to a third party. So we also don't have any insight into how the program is operating, also by design. The law was written that way. The Department of Education's contract with the third-party contractor was written that way. The Children's Scholarship Fund, which is a New York-based organization, they do everything with the voucher program. They determine who qualifies, who can get the money. They determine how much money that student gets. They also say, you can spend it on this and not on this. So they determine how the money can be spent. All of the decisions in terms of the voucher program rest in the Children's Scholarship Fund. The New Hampshire Department of Education basically gets a report every year that says, we have this many students, they write them a check, and then everything else is in the Children's Scholarship Fund. So when it comes to accountability and oversight, the state has essentially and effectively contracted all of that out. And it's really problematic because we don't have any data. Lawmakers last year passed a bill that said, hey, we want a performance audit on this, an independent performance audit. Our state auditors cannot do that performance audit because the Department of Education refuses to ask the Children's Scholarship Fund for the data that they need to do that independent audit. And so everything about the program is being shielded.
Well, and I have another question from the audience, but I just have to ask you, Josh, given your national experience, how unusual is this to have a private contractor manage this whole program and hold on to the data?
Not only is it not unusual, but the Children's Scholarship Fund actually makes an appearance in my book. They have been long-standing organizations in this space. Children's Scholarship Fund, as Christina mentioned, is based in New York. It was founded originally by John Walton of the Walton Family Foundation, who has since passed away, with seed money also from the DeVos family and other conservative organizations pushing this stuff. They have been doing this kind of thing since the 1990s, and although they're technically not structured as a for-profit organization, they do get to recover service fees for their operations and advocacy work, and that's the really important piece of this. The CFF have been a player in the advocacy space for vouchers since the 1990s. I worked with their Washington affiliate as a young researcher in the early DC version, where they were really heavily involved in lobbying for what became the first federal voucher system in DC that George W. Bush signed. He even named the Washington Scholarship Fund, again, CSF's affiliate in Washington, in his remarks from the Rose Garden, highlighting and his signing remarks, is what I'm saying. Here's what happened to the Washington Scholarship Fund, the CSF's affiliate in DC. 4 years later, the GAO, the government's watchdog organization, issued a scathing 79-page report about WSF's activities, saying they were mismanaging the money, they couldn't handle the volume, they didn't know how to do the work that they had signed up for, because again, it's mostly an advocacy organization that was distributing privately funded vouchers on the side before they got the federal contract. And here was the kicker: they weren't set up for, nor particularly interested in, income verification. This was the GAO's piece of it. They just weren't paying attention to whether or not the kids who were coming in actually met any of the eligibility requirements. And this has been going on for a really long time. Not only is it common in all these states with different organizations, but the CSF in particular has been doing this for a really long time. This is not a New Hampshire specific problem. I would encourage you all, these are on the for-profit side, but ProPublica, the independent journalism outfit, just published a story this morning on the for-profit side of these kind of operations. Different states have different rules requiring whether for or nonprofits can administer it, but the common thread between the for-profit and the nonprofit side is they're skimming dollars off of the top of each of this, and is fully allowed. No one, at least I'm not, no one's alleging any illegal behavior here. The point is, this is all made legal by the legislatures who are allowing these organizations to come in, service the contract, skim off the top, and continue their advocacy work across the country. And we see that they're actually not always up to the task in doing so.
Oh, that's interesting. And again, as I started diving into this topic, I, as an outsider, was surprised that a private organization was managing a program for New Hampshire kids. I thought that the Department of Ed would be doing it. So I was struck by that. Another question about accountability came in before our event today, and thanks for everybody who submitted these questions in advance. This is great. This person says, New Hampshire lawmakers are often asked, how can we have a voucher program that has no accountability for student outcomes? Sometimes they respond, well, let's look at test scores at public schools, where only 38% of students are proficient in math. Where's the accountability there? This person says, we all know the flaws in that argument, but to people less versed, it sounds very reasonable. This person wants to know, have you found an effective, non-defensive way to respond to this kind of statement? So go ahead, Christina, please.
Yeah, so when it comes to accountability with public schools, right, we have test scores. That is one facet of accountability. That is one measure. We have so many other measures. We have graduation rates. We have teacher certification rates in our classrooms. We can see the number of students who take AP courses, who take vocational education courses, right? We have so many different points of data that, you know, we can be really actively engaged in figuring out how our public schools are doing and what we can do better to better serve our students. And there's another layer of accountability, right? By voting for your school board, by being active participants. We have school boards that manage. Everything is public, right? Their meetings are public, their minutes. You can run for school board yourself, which I would highly encourage folks to do if they're interested. But, you know, we have that layer of accountability. We know who are making those decisions. We vote those people in who are making the decisions on how our public schools are working. And, you know, as we roll into March in our town meetings and our deliberative sessions and our voting days, right, we vote directly on our school district budgets, on our warrant articles, on how our public schools are run. So there are a multitude of ways that we can hold our public schools accountable, that we can find out how they're doing, and that we can engage in making reforms, in making changes in how they operate. With school vouchers, we don't have that, right? We don't have any choice we don't have any say in how the money is spent or anything like that. So they're just two wildly different scenarios in terms of accountability.
Sean, given your experience in Manchester, and also you have children in the Manchester schools, how do you talk about vouchers with your constituencies in Manchester? Parents, people who come to school board meetings, given what the data say about outcomes that Josh outlined for us.
Thanks. Yeah, my two children are both at Hillside Middle School in Manchester, and I think I try to convey to the constituents much of what we've talked about today. I mean, I think the new information for me is what Josh was saying about the data on student outcomes and the problems of how vouchers negatively affect student outcomes there, and I think that's something I want to take back to our community there. Can I mention a little bit about what you were asking, Christina, about the accountability and the test scores? Because I think, Manchester test scores are not great, and they're lower than we want them to be. And the answer to that is not take money away from our schools and give it to a select few, right? The answer is how can we better support our teachers? How can we better support our most vulnerable students there, right? And so our school board, our district's been working very hard to try and do that, right? We've revamped our curriculum, standardized it, we've increased teacher salaries, we have lowered class sizes with a much stronger class size policy than we've ever had before, and we're starting to have other ways in with our most vulnerable students there. We have a large population of multilingual learners, for example, so we've created a welcome center in the central part of Manchester that's helping our families integrate into the city, to really feel a sense of belonging in Manchester and in our schools there. And we've been trying to we have a new dual language immersion program in Spanish and in French there, the first and only programs of its kind in New Hampshire there, as another way of reaching out to our many different learners there. And I think, these are the types of things that we need to do as a district, right, to reach out to as many of our 12,000 students as we can in as many different ways, right? That's the differentiation. We need to do it in the classroom, we need to do it with our supports, we need to do it across the board there. And vouchers are not the answer. Vouchers are not going to help this, they're only going to hamper our progress.
And I want to talk about that second accountability bucket of finances, and we've discussed this some, but Christina, and then maybe to Noah, to you. So, Christina, you touched on this earlier, but touch on a little bit more the siphoning off effect of vouchers, because advocates of these programs often say that's not the case, that if a child is in public school, that's one less child they have to educate. We've touched on this before, that obviously if one child leaves a school, you can't do a one-for-one and have one less teacher, but just walk us through that siphoning off effect.
Yeah, so that refrain, we've seen it even from our own Department of Education. That just doesn't hold water here in New Hampshire, right? The fact that school vouchers, the idea that they don't siphon money off that's just plain false. The way that our state funds public schools, all of the money comes up, whether it's public school funding or school voucher funding, it all comes out of the Education Trust Fund. And so any dollar that's spent on on school vouchers is a dollar that's not available to be spent on public schools. And there are very real examples of this over the past 4 years, where lawmakers have been presented with bills to increase special education funding, to increase funding for public schools, for CTE, things like that. And they've repeatedly said, we don't have the money for this, we're gonna have to either table this bill, we're gonna have to kill this bill. We can't afford $17 million this year, so we're gonna have to kill this bill. And so, we're seeing these very real effects of the school vouchers eating that money in the Education Trust Fund so that it's not available for our public schools.
Yeah, no, I'd like you to jump in there too, given your expertise in this area.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me, there's definitely a misconception that all costs in schools are perfectly variable, that, losing one student, you can save the average per pupil spending in a district, or adding one student, you all of a sudden are on the hook for an additional $20,000, and that's, been used as an excuse in communities around the state to prohibit new housing construction because they're afraid that, they imagine little kids with $20,000 floating above their head. But that's not how it works. To add or lose a student, you're not saving or incurring all of this additional cost. But what is happening is you are losing the state fund that is attached to the small handful of kids who are leaving to take a voucher, and local property taxpayers who are already being overburdened by the way we fund our public schools are incurring additional costs as a result of that, and they're incurring additional costs as a result of the state not funding other programs and downshifting those costs onto local property taxpayers.
So a little bit more on the numbers. Christina, and this came up earlier before, but I want some more information. There are some income limits, as you described earlier, for a voucher in New Hampshire, but there's a House bill this year that would make access to vouchers universal, in other words, no income caps. So how much would that cost the state to provide?
So according to our research, that would cost the state over $100 million per year, every year. So the exact number is $102 million, but to extend school vouchers to every private school and homeschool student in the state would cost the state well over $100 million per year. Even partial expansion, so that's universal, that's 100% of students. But even partial expansion, which they're also talking about, would cost the state a significant amount of money. In our research, it's shown about $60 million, so we're effectively doubling to tripling the cost of the program. And in the way that the program is structured right now, our income limits are actually above the median household income. So any expansion is inherently serving wealthier families. And so that's also something to consider.
So partial expansion, $60 million.
About $60 million.
And full expansion, $100 million.
That's great.
So Noah, what's the frequent justification for these costs that you hear, and how do you unravel that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the proponents of expanding the voucher program have been have relied on a lot of the arguments that we've already sort of debunked and we pushed back on here. And I think maybe the more important thing is what we're spending money on instead of, by funding these voucher expansions. $100 million would make a huge impact on the state's ability to reimburse special education expenses that the state approves and requires. We have a decades-long backlog on school building aid requests that the state hasn't been able to fill because of its moratorium that it had. We have opportunities to expand career and technical education, and even we could just increase base adequacy and try and bring the state in line with the Conval ruling that came down in 2023. That bill, expanding base adequacy to the Conval number would cost $454 million above what the state is currently spending on base adequacy, and $100 million would make a serious dent in improving the amount of money that's going to all students and have a big impact on the property tax bills that people are seeing in their communities because of that influx of state funding.
So we have about just the last 10 minutes or so, and I have a couple look-ahead questions for all of you, because here we are, the new administration in Washington, a new governor here in New Hampshire, a new legislative session getting underway. At the national level first, Josh, please, what bills or legislation or efforts will you be tracking at the national level?
Well, thanks for the question. So just yesterday morning, as I was flying here, the Trump issued an executive order requiring a number of federal agencies to find discretionary funds and start to figure out ways. There's a lot of careful language, or not careful, vague language, but specifically targeted toward coming up with a way to create federal vouchers by executive order. Excuse me. Not entirely clear what any of that means. Trump did try a few of these things in his first term through the DeVos administration, the Department of Ed. They had some successes there, some failures, but we're talking about fairly small dollars from a federal perspective. A lot of that is show. A lot of that is just, I'm going to do this, you can't stop me. If they are able to move dollars out, these will just be very direct, concrete examples. As you all probably know, there's not really a federal education system per se, so the dollars that are discretionary at the Department of Ed or in HHS, the two of the agencies targeted by Trump to try to find these dollars, would be going to states. And they would be discretionary funds for states to use on funding some of the very type of programs we've talked about here today. The kind of other piece of this, which is kind of has more long-standing implications both nationally and for you all here, is a tax shelter bill disguised as a voucher scheme that was introduced this week in Congress. It's been introduced several times in several Congresses before, and they've never quite had the votes to get it through, mostly because Republicans, opposition to this stuff isn't just Democrats. There's strong red opposition to this stuff too, particularly for members of Congress who represent and legislators who represent rural communities. But now they think they have the votes to put into the federal budget reconciliation process. And what this thing would do is create a diversion program for wealthy folks to donate to scholarship granting organizations like CSF. Like CSF, to donate pieces of what they would owe the federal government in taxes, and instead of paying those taxes, moving those dollars into these SGOs that would distribute vouchers on a national basis, both here and in any other state. And that the price tag on that initial bill is starting at $5 billion. I've heard quotes that it may move up to $10 billion in legislation. And then all bets are off in further years after that. There's a lot of long-standing implications for that I don't really want to get into, but here's the thing I do want to mention. If they do pass that bill, and I am no federal lobbyist, I don't do whip counts, I have no idea whether it's going to, my understanding is it has a good shot if they get it through reconciliation. What I do not understand, even for a legislator on the fence on these type of decisions here in New Hampshire, Tennessee's taking a vote today, in Texas soon, Idaho, where I was a couple weeks ago. The feds are now talking about just picking up the tab for a lot of these voucher schemes. I don't want them to do it. I think it's bad policy. It's mostly at the federal version, it's just a tax shelter, as I explained. But we're talking about an order of magnitude of dollars that would be sent to do the very kinds of things that voucher supporters in your legislature and in the voucher advocacy community here in New Hampshire want to do anyway. And I gotta say, if that's gonna happen, why not just use the New Hampshire dollars for reinvesting in public schools here? And if the feds are gonna do what they're gonna do, let them pick up the tab. I don't want them to do it again, but that's what we're talking about here. So we could very soon, by say September of this year, depending on how things go here, have this universal expansion of vouchers here, and the feds coming in and doing the very same thing. And so this is a real threat. I think it's a tremendous problem for a lot of different reasons, but that's the thing I'm watching for this week. Trump's EO and then the tax credit, tax shelter legislation in Congress.
Really interesting. Christina, at the New Hampshire level, what particular piece of legislation would you be watching?
Sure, so the voucher expansion, of course. We are also watching an effort to create locally funded school vouchers. So these are school vouchers that are funded directly from school district budgets. The amount would be based on the state. It would be about $10,000 per student, but directly from school budgets, right? So we can imagine what that would do for our local public school districts. I'm also watching a few efforts. One that would prohibit taxpayer funds from being used for religious school education. That had a hearing last week. And I'm also, one of the other pieces that I'm watching is a bill that would require education service providers to perform background checks on staff that have direct contact with students. So right now, under current law, approved school voucher providers are not required to have background checks, even if they have direct contact with students. So there is legislation that would require that. It has been proposed since 2021 and has been consistently killed. So lawmakers have had the opportunity to require these background checks, and year after year they've said, nope, we don't want to do that. But that's legislation that I'm watching as well.
Noah, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely following a lot of the same stuff, keeping a close eye on bills that would bring the state in line with the Conval rulings and increase base adequacy aid, bills that would reform the statewide education property tax to deal with that lawsuit, which we could have a whole other panel on swept. But also, like, thinking about keeping an eye on, you know, representatives who maybe are voting for voucher expansion. Where do their votes stand on increasing funding for our public schools? Are they going to vote for vouchers and then say we don't have funds to expand special education reimbursements? Are they going to say, well, we can't afford to change the way we measure students living in poverty by using Medicaid numbers instead of free and reduced lunch forms as that component of the adequacy formula, just because it would cost money, even though, you know, the state has said that those students need more resources to succeed at the level of their peers, but they're just not counting them because it's going to cost too much money. I think we're going to be keeping a close eye on that sort of thing. You know, are people voting for voucher expansion and then saying that, you know, there's not enough money for our public school students?
Sean, go ahead. What will you be keeping an eye on in particular?
Well, there's so much. I think I'd echo what Christina and Noah said there. We're following a lot of those bills too. You know, I mentioned before, you know, we in Manchester, we've been trying to have these new programs and trying to reach out and trying to revise our curriculum, and it's really the first time our city's really had an upswing in education in a long time. And so we really feel that we have some momentum there. We've seen preliminary data where our graduation rate has gone up just a little bit, and we've seen data that our college and career readiness has gone up 20% over the last couple of years. These are great things there, right? So we feel that we have this momentum, but the threat of vouchers, right? The threat that that funding, even that chronically underfunded funding that we have, is taken away, really is something that is concerning for us there. And we feel a kind of squeeze on public education right now as a board there. It's the vouchers are maybe the most obvious squeeze there, but we've seen a revision of the minimum academic standards for the state, the Ed 306 rules that have really watered down standards for the state there. And really, you know, if we didn't have a strong board and a strong district, we could be saying, well, if we don't have enough money to support our special ed students, we have to do that, and we're going to have to start cutting other things there, right? Like physical education, like arts, like teachers. We can't have our class size policy anymore. And so this squeeze on standards, on vouchers, and we've seen teacher credentialing costs skyrocket over the past year, over 300%, right? Like, it's making it harder for people to make the decision to become teachers in public schools, right? And so this squeeze on public education, it's reaching a kind of critical point there. And so these bills have huge consequences this session there. The vouchers are the money part, the funding, like Noah said there, with the lawsuits there, but it's also in the policy making that's going on in the Department of Education that's really threatening to divert all of our attention to those 10% rather than protecting our 90% that really need that support.
Well, and last question, because I know people have to get on with their day, but I'll start with you, Sean. Beyond sort of specific bills, specific budgets, and so forth, what are your hopes for the future, for the sort of big picture?
I don't know if I let myself hope in that way. I think we hope that there is a kind of radical reformulation of funding for public schools in New Hampshire there, because the current funding system, even though it's underfunded and chronically so there, is still based on zip code, right? That's the reason why Manchester's budget is so much lower per student than other districts there, and that it's based on local property taxes there. And I know that we have representatives that have proposed new ways of reformulating funding in New Hampshire there, and it's very rigorously done with a study that was done through University of New Hampshire there. And I think that, in my hope, that the legislature would be open to such a reformulating of how we do funding in New Hampshire in a way that's much more equitable across the state.
How about you, Noah? Big picture hopes for the future, beyond all the specifics.
I mean, we're really excited right now. It feels like there is a lot of momentum towards school funding reform, you know, in the courts, but also like just in our work that we're doing out in communities. So we were at Kearsarge High School earlier this week. We had over 130 people come for one of our presentations to learn more about how we fund education in New Hampshire. You know, on the heels of their vote to reject a budget cap in their district, to learn what they can do next, to talk to their legislators and try and make a difference at the state level. And I guess I feel, as you know, a New Hampshire public school student myself, that what I hope for is that all of the kids in the state, you know, through a restructuring of the way we fund education and a recognition that we are a small state and that it's not just about the kids in your local school that are important, it's about all of the children in the state getting a high quality public education. I want them to all have the same opportunities that I got to have, you know, going to Nashua schools. So I think that, that's really what I'm hoping for, and I feel like there's a lot of growth and movement in that direction that we're excited about.
Well, and actually, Josh, I want to go to you next, and then I'll let Christina finish it out. But your hopes for the future.
Yeah, thanks. So just echoing some of what everybody said, we've talked a lot about numbers today, and we've talked about data and to some extent, things like that. I guess one thing I just want to leave you with is just on that whole piece, while the evidence against school voucher schemes has accumulated over the last decade, there's been another evidence base that's been accumulating, and that's been the evidence showing that deep, sustained commitments to funding public schools actually works. It's a complete myth that the other side has created, that this is just throwing money at problems. You get what you pay for, folks, and that's true both when we're talking about state budgets, when we're talking about your household budgets, when you're talking about how you prioritize your own spending in the future, that you get what you pay for the most part. And it's not, you know, while we're asking for, while we're saying that those deep, sustained commitments to public schools should be in place and the data are there, it's the right thing to do, too. And there's lots of other things that we can do when we spend those dollars that is driven by the evidence, but does reflect our values, does just reflect the kinds of things that I hope we can talk more about in the future. Things like investments in early childhood, things like investments in grow your own teacher pipelines, things like investments in pre-K, things like investments in universals, in updated HVAC systems. You mentioned this ruling that cold kids aren't being denied an inadequate education. That's not only silly on its face, but there's actually strong research-based evidence that show, surprise, cold kids don't learn very well. Hungry kids don't learn very well. And so, like, all of these things are on the table when we just sort of do the obvious and make those commitments back into the public school systems. Again, it's not only the right thing to do, but there's a strong research base to support it. So those two twin things of what seems to work and what's the right thing to do, I think should be the guiding principles going forward, and I hope that they are.
Yeah, Christina.
Yeah, so I would just echo what everyone said, and what really gives me hope is the incredible turnout and the dedication of Granite Staters, right? They show up to their town meetings in support of public schools. Thousands showed up at the school voucher expansion hearing, over 3,000 people, and their message was, we want to support our public schools. We want you to support our public schools. And this momentum is so inspiring, and it just gives me so much hope. And what's happening in the world, it's so heavy, but I look at what's happening in communities, and it's so inspiring, and I think that's really what's moving me forward.
All right, well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have this morning, but I really want to thank our panelists for being here. This was just terrific. And again, congratulations to Reaching Higher New Hampshire for pulling this event together at this very important time. And I want to invite Nicole Heimann back up for some closing remarks. Do you want the mic?
I think, can folks still hear me? Okay, I think I'll just speak naturally then. First, I just want to say, wow. Like, everybody shined today, and the message was just spot on from local school board, local community perspective about how this policy and how vouchers are impacting schools and students, to the more holistic school funding perspective and how vouchers are siphoning money away from the Education Trust Fund and impacting our public schools, to the state and federal policy perspective, and learning about this really well-coordinated effort to take money away and fund vouchers and really benefit our wealthier families and students. So just so thrilled that the folks who are sitting up here were able to join us today and really share that information and engage in some of this thought partnership that we were able to benefit from this morning. In addition, thank you to Laura for moderating and facilitating such an expert panel. I don't think any of us could have done it better. So real, genuine thanks for that. And I think I would just end on this notion of hope. So glad that our panelists spoke about that this morning. And I know, many of us have acknowledged just how heavy things are. But even in just this room alone, there's so much hope. The people who showed up today, the people who submitted questions, the information and knowledge we're all leaving with this morning into our afternoons is going to be impactful. And we just ask that you continue showing up because, as Christina said, there is huge momentum building here in New Hampshire with 3,000 folks showing up for the voucher legislation in our state alone. There is a lot of hope and a lot of momentum in just this collective commitment to public education where the vast majority of students go. So one final housekeeping remark, and that is I do want to remind folks that Give Students Bookstores here, I see that a lot of people did purchase books. I was able to scan the room from the back, and Josh has a little bit of time to also sign them. So I just wanted to flag that little reminder, and again, just deepest gratitude to our audience, to our panelists, to Laura, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the Reaching Higher team. We are a small but mighty team. There are 4 of us on our team. Christina, as you all met, Policy Director. Kayla Provincier in the back, our Policy Researcher. Kelly Untike, who's really the mastermind behind this event. So she deserves all the accolades as our Director of Public Relations. So thank you.